All right, hello and welcome to today's webinar, the 2017 Compliance Survey Results. We ask that anyone who has dialed in, please mute your microphone in order to eliminate any background noise during the presentation. This webinar is going to consist of a 50-minute presentation followed by a 10-minute question and answer session. Please do feel free to post any questions in the chat box throughout the webinar, and we will either answer them as you ask or in that Q&A session. If we do not happen to get to your question, someone from our team will follow up with you. Today's webinar is eligible for CTP and FP&A recertification credits. The credit form, a copy of the deck, and the recording will be sent via email in the next 7 business days. Due to some unforeseen circumstances, Melody will not be able to join us as one of our presenters today. This will not affect your credits or the contents of the webinar. We are very pleased to have Stephanie Villatoro giving our presentation. Stephanie is a senior consultant at Strategic Treasurer. She provides clients with realistic solutions to their challenges in the context of leading and best practices. Stephanie is responsible for technical content, effective project management, and ensuring that projects are delivered on time and within budget. Her experience as a Treasury practitioner and a Treasury consultant is highly valued by clients as she assists companies with their global Treasury projects, Treasury and risk technology engagements, and banking relationship/service efforts. We are excited for today, so now, Stephanie, I will turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Meredith. And welcome, everyone, to our 2017 Compliance Survey Results webinar. I apologize that Melody can't make it today and give you, 2 people to listen to, but I guess you just get to listen to one voice, and hopefully I don't become too monotonous for you there. So we're going to start off with some statistics today around our survey respondents first, and then move into the different categories of our survey questions, starting with bank structure and ending with SWIFT CSP. And we'll finish off today with some key takeaways. As you can see, we have been doing this survey for 4 years now. 48% of companies in the past survey were over $1 billion in revenue. So it is a lower percentage in that demographic versus last year, which was 63%. The difference is primarily seen in an increase in the percentages of companies with $500 million and lower of revenues. And this increased from 20% last year to 37% last year, or this year, sorry. So it will be important to look at how that impacts some of the responses that we're looking at today. This slide here, it shows the regions that the respondent companies operate in. The majority of companies responding we see are headquartered in the U.S., so this high United States component is expected in our responses. Regions are pretty widespread, with the highest foreign concentration we can see in Western Europe, followed by Asia-Pac and then Latin America. In our survey, we see 73% of companies operate in 20 or fewer countries, versus last year, that percentage was 55%. This is another one of those indicators, as I mentioned, that's increased in the respondent companies from the area of $1 billion or less in revenue. Additionally, not shown is that there were 66% of companies that had less than 6 people on their Treasury staff. Last year, this was only 55%, and again, that's in relation to the demographics that we're seeing in the size of companies. These survey questions are regarding bank structures in a company's headquarter country and internationally. One thing that we notice here is that there are less international account relationships, and that's probably due to the population of the survey, again, changing to more companies smaller than $1 billion. In the chart on the left, it reflects the number of banks used in the headquarter country. And we see a marked increase in this 3 to 5 bank range by 10%, taking the survey results to 36% in 2017. There's a corresponding decrease in the 6 to 10 bank range and less than 10 banks as well. We believe this is indicative of both the respondent population, but it's also due to the trend of companies consolidating bank relationships. We also see this reflected in the chart on the right, which shows the number of banks used internationally. You will note there's a large decrease in the more than 10 banks column on the far right from 45% to 29%. The column on the left side, in the columns on the left, there's a total of 40% of companies that have 0 to 2 international bank relationships compared to 24% last year. This is probably also indicative of the increase in respondents with revenues of less than $1 billion. So for this survey question on total bank accounts, we separated, for your benefit, the responses to show the differences between companies that were less than or greater than $1 billion. As you can see, the size of the company appears to have a major impact on the number of bank accounts. So this is total bank accounts. The blue bar represents, or the blue bars represent account ranges from companies that are under $1 billion, while the orange bars reflect accounts of companies over $1 billion. Between all companies, regardless of size, we see 40% have over 100 accounts, which includes 29% of companies over $1 billion and 11% under. And a total of 35% of the respondents are publicly traded, and 68% of those companies have international subsidiaries. This slide's a little jarring just from the title alone. The knowledge of FBAR is decreasing. So FBAR is the financial bank account reporting. This was an interesting result because generally people expect that over time knowledge of a topic is going to grow. Well, we don't believe that the zombie brain eaters came into Treasury departments and removed all that information. Instead, we feel that there are other reasons for this result. What this shows is an increase in those that are an expert to 20% versus last year's 14%. But the knowledgeable category has declined by almost 20 percentage points, and the number with limited knowledge has grown almost 10 percentage points versus last year. First, it's important to remember that Treasury people move around and into other areas, and new people come in all the time. Those that are new would be less likely to be knowledgeable on this topic. Additionally, since we have a higher respondent percentage of companies that are under $1 billion than in 2016, this could also account for a portion of these changes year over year. This next slide here shows percentage of small companies and larger companies that have filed FBAR for individual signers. This is not the company filing, but individual filings, or provided them the information to file themselves since 2010. So what you're going to notice is a distinct difference between those companies over $1 billion and those that are under $1 billion in revenue. About a third of large corporations have filed individuals FBAR for the past years, while conversely a third of small companies have not filed. This may be in part due to less awareness, but as you may recall from an earlier slide, there was a significant presence overseas for all companies. The largest region of concentration was in Western Europe, with 54% of companies having a presence there. There was a presence also in many other regions at levels between 20 and 50%. This says at a minimum, one would expect that about 50% of all companies still need to file. So both large corporate and companies under $1 billion are behind on their compliance filings, and companies under $1 billion are even more so behind. So we've seen an increase since last year in companies utilizing balance reporting for gathering information for their filings. Over 90% are using Treasury balance reporting versus 3/4 of the companies last year. This corresponds to the increase in reporting. However, there are multiple categories that are still used to a large degree, indicating that companies are unable to obtain all the balance information from reporting. So they need to use other methods, like contacting their bank or requiring legal entity reporting. And some are still using the general ledger, which this is not compliant with the FBAR requirements. FBAR, it requires that the highest daily balance, which the general ledger would not reflect, and not just the general ledger balance at month end. If it is an account or a bank account where the balance doesn't change very much, this might work, but the company would still be required to have a statement information supporting the information that they're filing. While full visibility to balances, it's a leading practice, there are accounts which may have little activity and a low balance that may be costly to obtain reporting. So companies may be opting out of reporting for these types of accounts electronically. So this slide, it shows a series of trends. It's kind of busy. My apologies for that. The good news is that you can see on the far right, manual processes for gathering and reporting has decreased from 44% to 37%. Some of this might have moved to the left to areas that include automatic data gathering with manual reporting, as we have seen an increase here. On the left side of the chart, you see a decline in the use of FBAM, or bank account management systems, by 3 percentage points, with only a 1% increase in the use of a TMS for information gathering. Midway in the chart, an interesting increase is the use of aggregators. While this is still minimal, it's tripled from 2% to 6%. And while it's a very intriguing change, it's certainly not a key change, since it still represents a very small sample of companies in our respondents. But if we look overall, not just at the year-over-year changes, manual information gathering and manual reporting still lead the pack in FBAR processes. If you look at the 3 set of bars on the right that include manual gathering or manual reporting processes, they account for 75% versus last year's 78%. So the overwhelming majority of companies have some form of manual effort within their FBAR process, and this has not changed significantly over the last year. From prior year surveys, we expanded the response options in the 2017 survey for this one. Additional responses that are included here include that they have no plans, or they have no plans because it's not required, and the last one is that they expect to file on behalf of their individual signers. For companies that will be providing the FBAR filing information to individual signers, dropped from 43% to 17%. This is a trend that will continue to decline as companies file for their signers, since it is a function of their job. A large number of respondents have no plans, that total 40%. This includes the 17% that don't think it's required. The larger amount of companies that do not have any plans could be that smaller company population of less than 1 billion. So we continue to see a trend of having less signers on foreign accounts. This is true across the board, from the no signers there to those that have more than 60 signers. Notably, the category of no U.S. signers has more than doubled and now stands at 28%. Companies with 1 to 15 signers has declined around 10 percentage points, but it is still the most common, with about half the companies falling in this category. Looking at companies that have 15 signers or less accounts for approximately 80% of the respondents. While no one really likes doing FBAR data gathering and filing, there has been a shift in who is responsible for it. Last year, it was it was about evenly split between tax and Treasury for responsibility, but this year we're seeing a shift to be overwhelmingly in Treasury. In fact, it shifted about 20 percentage points. Legal has picked up some companies' FBAR responsibility, but it is a minor amount at less than 10% there. While the shift in respondents from companies under $1 billion may account for part of this difference, it's likely that most of the change is actually due to the fact that Treasury is the source of the data. So for the signers and the bank accounts, that all comes from Treasury. Outsourcing and the methods of filing have changed somewhat in these survey questions. We can see that the number of companies filing for individuals has remained roughly the same as last year. However, the percentage of companies providing written information to individuals for them to file has jumped almost 10 points. That's percentage-wise. Outsourcing has remained pretty stable, but companies who are unsure if they will handle it themselves or outsource is up about 10%. This may also be due to the change in the size of companies, or it might be new to them, or this could be that more people are actually just filing FBAR now. So FBAR filing for individuals, beginning January 1st, 2018, it's now required to be filed in an XML format. When asked if companies were ready to file in XML, 35% said that this is not applicable to them. As you recall from the prior slide, 28% of companies would have to file XML because they are providing written information to individuals for the individual to file. This implies that 7%, which is the difference from the 35 in the not applicable column, are not required to file or they don't intend to file. Importantly, 27% have responded that they are unable to file in XML. We expect that this population, this 27%, or a good portion of it, will join that 13% that already outsource it. So next year, as we see these results, it'll be interesting to see how the trend actually moves for those that can't do this. Are they going to outsource it? So moving on to what systems you use, we see that almost 60% of companies are still using Excel as their main treasury management tool. That's no shock to us, I don't think any of us. A lot of companies use a TMS, which is a treasury management system, but they continue to use Excel as an additional tool. The reason for this is that some of their needs cannot be met by only a TMS, and Excel is used when they have more complex analysis and reporting requirements. As TMS providers become more sophisticated in their analytical and reporting offerings, we expect these numbers to flip somewhat between the TMS and Excel, with Excel decreasing. However, we don't ever expect Excel to completely go away. It's interesting to me to see this 10% of respondents replied that they don't use a TMS, a bank provider, or Excel. The only thing I could think of here is that they probably use the general ledger as of reporting for cash, and this is probably more likely to occur in a smaller company that doesn't have a formalized treasury group. A standout this year, as in past years, is the use of spreadsheets to track bank accounts. So we just talked about Excel, and this is no surprise here. It's remained in that 40 to 60% range, peaking this year at 57%. We also see a marked increase in paper-based file folder tracking, which is up at 17% from 2% last year. Legal entity systems also increased substantially from 1 to 9%, and all three of these are likely reflective of the increase in those respondents that are less than $1 billion in revenue. Another trend we are seeing is the move away from a formal BAM system, which is a bank account management system, and it's replaced with an increase in TMS systems, where the largest being in the SaaS versus an installed treasury management system. Installed systems are up only 2 percentage points versus last year, and SaaS systems are almost up 10% over last year. So it's not surprising SaaS are over installed systems. We've seen an increase in the number of companies investing in technology for Treasury, and SaaS in general, it has more attraction to companies because of the lower cost, lower maintenance and upgrade costs, or just management of that, and also the ease of integration of the system. So you have one system that does many, many things versus multiple systems doing a piece of it that have to integrate to each other. So we do see that trend happening. So you'll note here the two bars in orange. 64% of companies use their bank account management system, whatever that might be, Excel to a TMS to an actual formal BAM system, to track signers, and 38% also track the dates the signers are active, so like a to and from time frame. And this is an important component for FBAR reporting. So BAM systems tracking is heavily used for signers because of that FBAR requirement these days. So not many respondents have or are using BAM systems to actually create the FBAR files, the batch files, and the PDFs. We only see 12 to 13% filing batch files and smart PDFs through their systems. This means that data tracked for signers for FBAR filings is primarily handled manually. We've seen that a number of TMS providers are improving their FBAR offerings, so we would expect to see the amount of companies filing on an automated basis to increase. Sorry, I'm talking so much, my mouth's getting dry, so I had to take a break for a drink. Hopefully everyone's awake. On this slide, we see the number of respondents feeling that their system is well controlled or pretty good, if down from 75% with last year's 82%. This drop is due to the number of respondents feeling their tracking system is well controlled from 20% down to 13%. Companies have been becoming more aware of leading practices and controls in bank account management and may have shifted their opinion regarding their internal controls. As companies are starting to file FBAR, they are finding that their controls are not quite as good as they thought. This is shown in the decline from 2014, where the well-controlled category was 28%. So here we're seeing just an overall change in how people view their controls internally in their system, and there's a decline in that. And that could be from compliance requirements and FBAR, people catching up on their FBAR filings, and they're actually seeing that going back historically is very difficult. They're putting those controls in place now, or they see that they're not well controlled today. This chart, or there's two charts here, but this chart on the left shows this year's responses, and the chart on the right shows prior year responses for the same question. We see a shift from the prior years towards centralization at headquarters of managing foreign bank accounts. The number at headquarters has moved from the mid 40% over the past 3 years to 54% this past year. Conversely, the number at regional treasury centers or by entity or by division have all decreased from an overall 48% to 29%. So we're seeing a trend to further centralization given the increasing in technological capabilities in Treasury. So this goes kind of in line with, we see people not happy with their controls from the previous slide to them moving to more of a consolidated view of their bank account management or administering their bank accounts outside of their headquarters in the U.S. They're just internationally because of compliance reasons. So moving to eBAM. So we see a slight increase in the use of eBAM from 12% in 2016 to 16% this past year. While that's a good trend, it's not a game changer because the use of eBAM by companies is still a smaller number. The amount expecting to add eBAM over several years has remained about the same. The number not planning to adopt or they're not sure is the real story here. Those two bars account for about half of the respondents. This again, it's consistent with prior years. So we do not expect to see a large movement in the use of eBAM in the short term. From our perspective, banks' widespread ability to provide eBAM to the market to its customers will need to be, they will need to drive it to move into that eBAM. Currently, the number of banks that offer this is limited primarily to the larger banks. And we expect this to be a process of slow adoption by banks and by corporates. Why are banks going to the market if corporates aren't using it? And why are corporates going to use it if all of their banks don't offer it? It's a catch-22. So we see this eventually being driven by corporates. They're going to be requesting this from their banks, and banks are going to have to develop it at the request of their large clients. But a corporate is not going to implement eBAM if the majority of their large banks do not offer it. So that's where the catch-22 comes into play. So an issue here for FBAR reporting is that there's a lack of integration of bank account administration and FBAR reporting. As you may recall, on a prior slide, we showed that around 60% of companies track signers and accounts in Excel, and this is not going to integrate with their FBAR reporting. On a separate slide, we detailed the various processes being used for this. Respondents who answered that they have a manual process for either gathering data or reporting data totaled about 75%, which is reflective on this slide as well, because it shows a comparable percentage for FBAR not being integrated. Only 16% said their bank account management system is integrated with FBAR, and these are likely TMS users, keeping in mind that not all TMS systems are fully FBAR integrated, but some of them are. So you're seeing some of them utilize treasury management systems for that. So bank account administration policies have been becoming more diligent. We see a significant decrease by half in the number of companies who do not have a policy on bank account administration. So those that didn't have one, there's half less than last year. We'll note that the top green bar, which declined from 14% to 7% this year. Farther down on the graph, there are two more notable green bars, which show significant shifts in transaction level controls and also account level controls. Transaction controls increased 16 percentage points to 52%, and account controls shifted 7% to 51%. So this is important that over half of companies now have these types of controls in place. Some examples of account level controls and transaction level controls. Account controls are positive pay or ACH block. Transaction level controls are typically on individuals from an initiation and a release level. Maybe it's a total amount that they can release per transaction or per day. So companies who have done bank account audits also shows a shift from last year's survey between those who have done an audit in the last 2 years to those who have completed an audit from 3 to 5 years. So those that have done audits within 2 years has dropped. We see 71% this year, but it has dropped from 88% last year. In the 3 to 5 years, and we've seen increases similar to the other decrease. So 3 to 5 years all the way and never have all increased. It's important to note that 10% here have never ever done an audit. Bank account audits, it's a key aspect of control on bank account administration. It's important to have strong bank administration controls to protect the company from unauthorized access to accounts. This is keeping up your signers, making sure the bank actually makes the changes that you've submitted. Bank account audit is also an important method of ensuring a robustness of a company's bank account administration process. Switching back to the last slide before we move on. I can't tell you how many times I've done bank account audits when I was on the corporate side where I found old employees that have left the company still on accounts where we had removed them. So it's a huge risk if you don't audit what you have with your banks, especially with signers. Okay, moving on to the next slide here. So a majority of companies are aware of the SWIFT attestation requirements, and 56% of companies have or will have completed that CSP process and the attestation by the end of last year. Most of these were in process, as only 6% had already completed it. Another 13% are aware, but they haven't begun the process yet. So, and then surprisingly, 31% weren't even aware of what was going on with SWIFT CSP. Some of those who are not aware, or who are aware and have not done anything, may not be required to attest. But if they are, non-attestation will be quite visible to their counterparties. The purpose of the attestation process is to be fully transparent regarding the controls you as a company has in place over transactions through the SWIFT network. Your counterparties have visibility of this online with SWIFT. If they, so this is your counterparty, if they're not satisfied that you have put in place sufficient required controls, they could potentially elect not to transact with you as a company. By the end of this year, December 31st, 2018, SWIFT has the right, additionally, to notify your counterparties that your company is non-compliant with SWIFT controls. That means you haven't attested or you haven't fully attested. So if you're not sure, it's important to assess internally whether your company is required to attest, and if you are, put in place a roadmap to implement these required controls. Companies who must attest either utilize a SWIFT network, or they have a SWIFT BIC, or they're using a service bureau's BIC. There are companies that have a SWIFT BIC that was not obtained for Treasury purposes, but for accounting purposes. So it's important to determine if you even have a SWIFT reporting in other areas of the company, not just within Treasury. "57% of companies have not planned for training, or they're unsure of training, or they've only provided one-time training. None of these, or the one-time training, is not compliant with SWIFT, who is requiring ongoing training. This is part of that SWIFT attestation. 31% have subscribed to or developed an annual training process, and 13% of companies are trying to determine what the training process is going to be. So training is a key component of SWIFT customer security program and continuing attestation for SWIFT. It is supposed to be a robust, constantly updated, and it's supposed to be provided on an ongoing basis to your employees. So although training, annual training, it's good, ongoing training is more robust. During the course of any year, you might have some new employees come in and existing employees change departments or roles. These people that are moving around as they start their new role also need to be trained to ensure proper controls are in place. The training should cover the gamut of types of fraud and various controls over fraud, over wires, controls on computer hygiene, and it should also be available company-wide for individuals in positions that are involved in the transaction processes around the world. So not just your headquarters, but anyone in the process of making payments. So this could be inside of Treasury, outside of Treasury, and all of the above. So moving on to intercompany loans. Sorry, I had not intercompany loans. Further requirements. Almost 60% of companies here you see on the green are not really sure whether there will be additional requirements imposed on companies from other channels and networks. So this question was asked because of the SWIFT attestation. Do you think there's other areas or other channels that are going to require things like this? We see that a third feel there will be some additional requirements, and 10% who don't believe there will be other requirements coming down the road. But overwhelmingly here, almost 60% pretty much think there will be, or they're not sure, I'm sorry. It's our view that there will be increases in market volatility and increases in fraud attempts. That's not going away. They just change how they do it. Cybersecurity is going to be an ongoing issue. So all of these factors are going to fuel new requirements from various areas or different organizations or channels down the line. So I do think we're going to see some, but we'll just have to wait and see what actually comes after this SWIFT attestation this year. Now we can move on to intercompany loans. So with the requirement of compliance with Section 385 of the tax code, there are actually 48% of companies who have either completed the compliance process or who expect to be complete by the end of January this year, so the end of this month. We see 28% of companies who are required to comply have not done so or were not aware of the requirement, which you can see by the two orange bars together on the chart, the 16 and 12%. Fortunately, this deadline has been kicked out to January 2019, so we have another year. But it's important that companies who have not done so get into compliance for this, for Section 385. There are important rules for the documentation of intercompany loans, and these must meet the IRS test. If you're not aware, please look on our website for our past webinars. We had one on this topic that you can download and listen to, or you can contact me or the ladies in the office, and we will gladly forward a copy to you if you do need this on Section 385. I think you can also click the link. And just to let you know, any information on our website is part of our Inform, and it is free for corporates. Continuing on 385, these stringent requirements on intercompany loans did not result in material changes in companies. So why? Why didn't companies change because of this compliance requirement? Like we saw in FBAR, where you have less foreign or U.S. signers on foreign accounts. We see that 48% of companies either made no change to their intercompany loans, they kept the same amounts, or they increased them. Only 13% eliminated or reduced the number of intercompany loans they had outstanding. While one might expect those loans to have decreased more, not if you really think about it. Intercompany loans are not put in place for earnings stripping. There are a number of loans put in place for funding, for cash flow reasons, for transfer pricing purposes, and any other number of reasons that are business operations. These purposes are inherent to running the business, and the need for these loans are not going to decrease. So whereas having a U.S. signer on a foreign account is not really necessary in the long run, having an intercompany loan in place to fund a subsidiary that's a startup is definitely a need. I mean, you need those intercompany loans in place. So we didn't see as many changes. And I think some of the decreases or increases probably that we did see were companies taking a look back at what they were doing in order to optimize what they were doing to be compliant. So as they did all the compliance requirements, they probably realized they needed more or needed less. So I know this might seem very obscure, with 45% unsure or not fully aware or not preparing, and it's been widely publicized. It has not been widely, It has not been widely publicized in the U.S. This is a European requirement, which may have you wondering why it's pertinent here today. The GDPR, or General Data Protection Regulation, is a European regulation that requires all companies, whether they're European or not, to put in place certain controls over the data of individuals who are in the European Union or citizens of the European Union. Keep in mind, the European Union will also include the UK. This means that it certainly affects your European subsidiaries, but to the extent that a European Union citizen's data rests on any system outside of Europe, or any system outside that can pull data from a system inside the European Union, it would apply to them. Only 7% are ready for GDPR, which goes into place on May 25th, 2018. So that's only a few months away. 20% are in the process of preparing. Non-compliance will result in a fine that it's the greater of either 20 million euros or 4% of their worldwide revenue. So very, very steep non-compliance fines. If you are not aware or need additional information, we had a webinar on this topic as well, which you can download from our website. So some key takeaways. Foreign bank account, or FBAR, foreign bank account reporting. I think a key takeaway here is more and more companies are filing. With all the changes in the regulation of how to file, what format to file in, and what information to include, and how you file, that has put a stinger on kind of automating the process, because every year it's changed. So what I'll see is, until this regulation really stabilizes, you're not going to see streamlined processes in place, because companies are having to react every year to a different change. So the other trend I'm seeing with FBAR is less and less U.S. citizens or U.S. residents are involved in the process on foreign bank accounts, whether it is a physical signer on the account, someone who initiates or releases wires on a foreign account. All of those are considered signers according to FBAR. For eBAM, we talked about this, but it is going to be a very, very slow adoption rate. It's that catch-22. Until all of a company's banks are offering it, they're not going to implement it, or maybe not all, but the majority of their large ones. And banks aren't going to develop it or be able to process eBAM unless their customers are going to utilize it. So it's that catch-22, and it's a vicious circle. So we're going to continue to see that kind of occurring on and on with electronic bank account management. So the adoption is just going to be much, much slower than we would like to see, especially when you get into international bank accounts. Different jurisdictions are not going to accept eBAM. Still today, we have banks wanting wet signatures on forms. So slow adoption internationally is also going to be a component of that. For Section 385, let's get down to the bottom there. It was put in place to prevent earnings stripping, which is where intercompany debt is put in place solely for the purpose of tax reduction. Many are aware of this and have worked to put the documentation requirements in place, but there's still a significant number of companies that have not begun. Fortunately, the deadline has been delayed, as we stated earlier, to January 2019, but interesting, companies have not altered their intercompany loans because they actually have a business purpose, so we don't see them going away. For GDPR, it's still not well known. This is a regulation that's relating to the data of European Union citizens, but it applies to any company across the globe that has any data of UK residents as well. Email, this includes email, address, phone number, physical address, your name, that's any of that personal identifiable information. So if a company has any of this, they must comply. It requires that you get consent for each specific purpose of the information. So let's think about a company like Amazon. They would surely have many foreign individuals' information from the European Union utilizing their services. So it's important that companies assess whether they have it, any of this personal identifiable information, and if they do, they need to make sure they meet those specified controls. Just like we see from other regulations, there will be steep penalties there. So Meredith, I'll hand it over to you.
Sure, so I'd love to chime in here for a second, Stephanie. With all of these regulations, I just wanted to ask, how should corporates stay up to date on current and future compliance changes?
What I've seen with a few companies and kind of the trend that's definitely heading toward a leading practice across the board is with the high increase of fraud and other things that are triggering all of these compliance requirements. So they're constantly either changing. There are new ones out all the time, it seems like, that we have to be compliant with. But having ownership of that, not being reactive but proactive. And what I mean by being proactive is having someone responsible for it to know what's down the board, what's going to be required, putting processes in place where you are compliant. Once you're compliant, that becomes just a regular, day-to-day or month or year job for someone. But keeping abreast of everything that is going on or coming down the pipeline that you need to be compliant with in the future. So someone needs to be responsible for any of those and making sure new processes are put in place. Things like today's webinar, for instance, is a great way to keep abreast of what's going on in the compliance world and to keep abreast of everything that is coming in that pipeline, of knowing what your requirements are going to be and whether or not you even need to file or do anything. So that's what I mean by that. Thank you.
So in light of that, sure. In light of that, we'd love to gauge everyone's interest and provide more information as it becomes available. So we're going to move over a poll question. This is a very easy poll question because there is only one answer. So if you are interested in learning more about how to best plan for compliance, how to be proactive, go ahead and just click that yes button. And we'll kind of use that to gauge how we will provide this information in the future. So we'll just give that a minute and let you guys vote. And as we are voting, if you guys have any more questions, please do put them in the chat box. And we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, thank you guys for answering that. We're going to move that over to the side. And as we conclude here today, we just want to bring your awareness to a few of our live surveys. We have our Treasury Fraud and Controls survey going on right now, as well as the Treasury Perspective survey. These are both great ways to get some information, and if you do participate, you will get expanded information afterwards. In addition, we also have our Treasury Security Training course, so feel free to click any of those links to get more information or to participate in more surveys like the one that we have just gone over. I wanted to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. We do hope you found the presentation insightful and informative. We are going to stay online for a couple more minutes just in case there's any last-minute questions. Do continue to check our website often as we host many webinars throughout the year. I will be sending out the presentation deck, a recording, and the CTP credit form within the next 7 business days, so be on the lookout in your email for that. And thank you again. So we will stay on the line for a little bit longer to answer any questions, but we appreciate you guys for being here.